Yeah, that's right, Jeff. And I'll just highlight two other things from the conversation. And first, I'll start with something that I think we share in common, although you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think we were both on the older side for our classes in, elementary, middle, high school. I have a fall birthday, and I was quote unquote one of the older kids in my class.
Yeah, Michael, I wasn't that far behind you. I had a January birthday. And in the 1970s, I think there was a lot more flexibility to when kids can start school than there is today. So I was 5 turning 6 in January of my kindergarten year.
Yeah, and Jeff, I was effectively redshirted, which is something Richard will talk about. But in my case, I repeated kindergarten. Not a known fact, I think, by a lot of folks around me, but it definitely helped me. And Richard talks about how much the college problem is also a K-12 problem, which is the thing that I want to highlight here. Boys develop later on average. Richard says our fear of tracking, or I would modify it to say personalizing, along with the loss, frankly, of the no excuses philosophy that had been ascendant in the 90s and early 2000s. He says it's doing students no favors. And yet, as you'll also hear, Richard doesn't think we can let colleges off the hook.
Yeah, that was a good point because we often let colleges off the hook for a lot of things, Michael, where they'll just say, well, if K through 12 didn't send us these students, who can't do X, Y, and Z, then, we would be perfectly fine, right? We would have great retention rates, great graduation rates, really engaged students, right? They like to blame it on K through 12. And you're going to hear Richard bring up examples of marketing and even majors that can appeal to men. And what he's talking about is that colleges can be just as intentional about appealing to men as they are for other underrepresented students on their campuses. For example, having a men's center, for instance, and not just a women's center, or a Black cultural center, or an LGBTQ center, right? Why not do more intentional things for men, as he talks about?
So finally, Jeff, before we get to Richard, I just love to call attention to how he's thinking about outcomes in this conversation, because he's putting them squarely in terms of the economic implications in our conversation. But I will say this is all really hard to measure because as he also points out, men's education journeys are less linear than women's, which, as you know, and we've said to our listeners, we think is a broader trend for everyone right now across K-12, higher ed, and the workforce. But it's a bigger challenge, I think, for all of us as we shift, I hope anyway, to worrying less about the inputs of a college and more about the outcomes. And as Richard said, why this all matters for men is that, at least based on his research, on average, they need to see the relevance of what they're doing, the why, they're learning these academic things. And I'm going to guess that flows into one of your takeaways, having known you long enough at this point, is that
Michael, you know exactly what I'm going to say. Purpose, right?
Purpose, yes.
Right? Not only do men enroll at lower levels in higher ed than women, but they also complete at lower levels. And so we not only need to engage them, but we need to keep them engaged. And I think that's where the purpose comes in. So the purpose is, why to go to college. But then the purpose is, like, as you're sitting there and you're bored in class and you haven't found your friends or you haven't found your place on college, on campus, right? How do we keep you engaged? And, we know it's why some colleges have started football teams and esports, which is fine for those who play those things. But what about everything else? We know Greek life has also disappeared or has become a smaller player on many campuses. But, those are the things that are often referred to as the beer and circus part of college. And it's not what institutions, in my opinion, should be focused on when it comes to trying to appeal to men. I wonder if there's more of a pedagogical approach here. So for example, can we build in a gap year or a semester program for men to find their people and maybe get hands-on learning before college? We know that the hands-on piece of college is critical, that experiential learning, both in college and in the classroom overall. That's absolutely critical. And Richard is going to mention that. So how do we create a curriculum, for example, as we have both talked a lot about, with work integrated learning? And I think that's a lot harder for colleges to do. Engaging men, giving them a sense of purpose about higher ed, is about more than just putting pictures of male students in your admissions materials. It requires a much bigger intentional approach. It requires redesign of the programs. And frankly, it requires time and money that I think that most colleges are just not really willing to spend. And then the signpost I'll also plant as a heads up to what Richard is going to talk about is that we can talk about this issue. It has been taboo in higher ed, I think, for too long. And I also think, Michael, this is probably a matter of perspective, right? We're both fathers of daughters, which I know for me has come to shape my approach to this issue. Quite frankly, I'm probably less worried about it as a result. But when Richard's book came out, I was like, yes, I'm glad someone is calling this out because I do believe it has larger societal issues for the economy, for families, and frankly, I think basic functioning of a democracy. If we forget about a significant portion of the population when it comes to education. And as Richard will point out, the results of November's election might make it that more people in higher education are going to talk openly about this dynamic and the solutions. And with that, let's welcome Richard. Not only is he the author of the book of Boys and Men, but he's also the founding president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. And before founding that institute in 2023, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Richard, welcome to Future You.